In this video, I'm going to be covering some material that is dry to say the least, and is the part of the Old Testament where people tend to fall asleep or to lose interest and give up. And so bear in mind the goal here is not for you to remember all the details. The goal here is big picture. So we're going to be talking about priestly theology in particular. But we want to understand kind of the essence of priestly theology, not to know every single law or all the finer points of it. And so try to keep that in mind, that we're dealing with big picture here. Possibly the most important voice in the Old Testament is the priestly perspective or the priestly theology. We've already encountered that in the book of Genesis. In fact, we started with it. Genesis 1 is a priestly text. And so if you can recall back in Genesis 1, where we saw creation in 7 days, or really 6 days, and then the seventh day was a day of rest, and how creation took place very methodically, right? There were days, there were clear categories, and there was also a symmetry to it. So in the PowerPoint, you may go back to this and see that the first 3 days parallel the second 3 days in sort of a matching fashion. So light on the first day, and then the sun, moon, and stars on the fourth day. So there's a symmetry, there's an orderliness to it. If you can understand that, that is the essence of priestly theology, is that creation is orderly. But it's a fragile order. It's an order that needs to be preserved and is constantly falling apart. The priestly writers seem to have had some sort of an awareness of the concept of entropy, the tendency of things to fall apart, left to themselves, that they decay over time. But in the priestly thought, that is the result of sin. Or it's connected with sin. Sin causes creation to break down, because sin itself is sort of the root cause of that. Sin is a deviation from divine order. In fact, that the Hebrew word for sin, chata, it means to miss the mark, to deviate from what was the intended result, or to miss expectations. And so everything that we would call sin has the effect that it breaks down the orderliness of creation. It breaks down the categories, because sin itself is a violation of boundaries. You think back to Genesis 3, which is not a priestly text per se, but also does seem related here, that the first act of sin was a creature, humans, seeking to move into a new category, to become gods. And that's a violation, it's a transgression of boundaries. And we see many of the priestly laws are concerned with boundaries, maintaining those boundaries. There's also a lot of focus on what we call gradated holiness, that there are different zones of holiness, and that they need to be kept separate. In fact, that's what the word holy means. In priestly thought, holy does not mean what we tend to think of it in our culture. When we say someone is holy, we mean moral. To be holy is to be very moral. In priestly theology, holiness is not morality. Now, morality plays a role. God is moral, and God does give moral expectations. And so in order to be holy, you must be moral. But holiness is much more than morality. Holy, the Hebrew word kadash, means to be separate, to be different. So something that is holy is something that is set apart and different from other things, something that's special. So we see this, for example, in Genesis 1. The day that is declared holy is the seventh day, the Sabbath. What makes it holy? Well, it's different from the other days. It's different in multiple ways. One way in which it's different is that It's the only day when God doesn't create anything. God rests on that day, and that makes it holy. It makes it different from the other days. It's, sort of the old Sesame Street, one of these things doesn't belong. Well, here that's a good thing. Holiness means it's different from the other days. It's also holy in that it has no pair, right? All the other 3 days have a complementary day, something that completes them. Again, light created on day 1, the receptacles of light, the points of origin of those light, the sun, moon, and stars, are created on day 4. So the 7th day is different. It has no partner, and that also makes it holy. It's unique. So that's the central, the central idea in priestly theology is holiness. If you can understand what the priestly idea of holiness is, you can understand the priestly literature, and you can understand priestly theology. That for them, God is holy, meaning God is completely unique from everything else. And in order for him to stay holy, and in order for the things of God, such as the temple, or the priesthood, or the items in the temple, or even Israel itself, in order for them to remain holy, they have to remain separate from everything else. So Israel is holy because Israel is chosen. Israel is set apart and different from all the other nations. And if they cease to be separate, they cease to be holy. All right, this is why we get in the Old Testament, we get warnings against intermarriage with Gentiles. It's not that God just simply didn't like Gentiles. It's that Israel was chosen and made holy. And if they are not different, if they're not set apart from the other nations, they are not holy. All right? They're not holy doesn't mean they're better. It means they have a special task. All right? They have a calling. And we'll see that worked out throughout later texts. For example, in the prophets, where Israel kind of has a mission. They are the servant of God to be a light to the nations. Now, the priestly literature also concerns itself a lot with the temple. So these are books like Leviticus and the latter chapters of Exodus, where the instructions on all of the items that are to be created that will originally go in something called the tabernacle or the tent of meeting, which is a portable temple. Eventually they will end up in the permanent temple in Jerusalem as well. These texts deal a lot with the priesthood. Who gets to be a priest? What are the rules? So what are the rules for being a priest? Most of Leviticus is addressed to priests. It's about how do you offer sacrifices? How do you perform these rituals? And so that's part of the reason why it seems so boring. It seems irrelevant. But it was very, very important for them. Now, this literature, priestly literature is scattered. Much of it is in Genesis, but the highest concentration, those texts that are pretty exclusively priestly, are concentrated in the second half of the book of Exodus, all of the book of Leviticus, and parts of Numbers, especially the first 1/3 or so of the book of Numbers, are priestly texts. And they are all set at Mount Sinai. They occur over the span of 11 months, an extended stay at Mount Sinai, where God gives them all of these rules. And they are given to Moses as he stands up on the mountain and receives these instructions from God. And they include a number of different types of material. So we're going to look at some of these. Now, we'll begin really in Exodus 19. We're not going to focus on a lot of particular texts in this lesson, but Exodus 19 is an important one because this is when they are gathered at Mount Sinai and God appears to them visibly. This is called a theophany. Theophany means appearance of God. And this is perhaps the most important theophany in the Old Testament. God is on the mountain and his presence is manifest visibly in a cloud, in thunder, in lightning, and in fire. And that signals that God is on the mountain, just like Moses saw the burning bush. Here the people see God on the mountain. And as I mentioned, in priestly theology, because God is holy, God has to be kept separate from things. So we see that here, that there is a boundary, a perimeter set up around the mountain. So you shall set limits for the people all around, saying, be careful not to go up to the mountain or to touch the edge of it. Any who touch the mountain shall be put to death. So there's a boundary. Why? Well, because God is holy, and if something that is less holy or not holy at all comes into contact with something that is holy, it diminishes its holiness. All right? Again, they're not being snobbish here, but it's much the idea that just like if you were to go to a hospital and maybe you've got a patient who is under quarantine and they have to keep the room clean. Right, there can be no outside, contaminants. It's a clean room, so you have to wash before you come in. You have to wear the gown. You have to wear the face mask. It's because you could contaminate the room, and you could, if it has been cleansed of all outside contaminants, and you bring something in with you, then the room is no longer clean. Much the same in priestly theology. And here, God on the mountain, it needs to be kept holy. Because if that boundary is broken, then the mountain is no longer holy. And there's a danger in that. So what does he say? What he says in chapter 19, verse 21, that the Lord said, go down and warn the people not to break through to the Lord or to look, otherwise many of them will perish. Even the priests who approach the Lord must consecrate themselves, or the Lord will break out against them. There is danger here that if the unholy comes into contact with the holy, people die. And we see this in the priestly literature. That is dangerous. And this is a persistent theme throughout the priestly literature, the separation that needs to be maintained. So Moses is allowed to go up the mountain. He takes some of the elders and Aaron with him up to a certain point, but then they even can't come with him anymore. And the first thing that he receives is the Decalogue, or the Ten Commandments. So these are an example of what we call apodictic law. There are two types of law in the Old Testament. Apodictic law are these absolute rules. You shall not do this. You shall not kill. You shall not commit adultery. They are ground rules. They are foundational. They are foundations of Israelite ethics. They are not very practical as laws because they don't address what happens when someone breaks the law. All right? Laws need to have consequences for when they're broken. All right? And the Ten Commandments don't have that. They just say, you will not do this. In fact, they're worded almost the way we would word a statement talking to a child. We do not do this. All right? Not talking about the consequences, just establishing a moral foundation. And so the Ten Commandments are foundational laws. The first four of them, are primarily concerning religious matters. Worship of only one God, no idolatry, so there's a prohibition on making images of God or of anything else and worshiping them. Respect for the name of God. Don't take the name of the Lord in vain. Now, there's not talking about profanity here. They're talking about misuses of the name of God, probably in a divinatory or magical context. In the ancient Near East, the names of gods were considered to have magical powers, and if you could learn the secret name of a god, you could invoke and harness his power. And I think what this law is getting at is, don't try to do that. You can't control God. And then finally, the fourth commandment is about the Sabbath day. keep the Sabbath holy. And here you're following in God's example, right? In fact, here it invokes creation. It invokes Genesis 1. Just as God rested, right? For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but rested on the seventh day. So it's woven into the fabric of creation, this pattern of 7. So you rest on the seventh day because it is an inherently holy day. God made it so by resting. The second set of commandments, the next 6, all pertain to interhuman relationships. They are social laws. So honoring one's father and mother, prohibition against murder, against adultery, against theft, against bearing false witness. So these are sort of these universal laws of morality that are common to pretty much all cultures. And then also one, you shall not covet. And what that means is to so desire something that belongs to someone else that if you knew you could get away with it, you would take it. All right? Maybe you don't. So you don't. There's a difference between it and theft, but it is the desire to have something that doesn't belong to you. All right? Which is kind of an unhealthy thing, keep up with the Joneses. Oh, they've got this nice house, I have to keep up with them. That sort of mentality. So it seems to be kind of to head off maybe materialism and too much of a focus on having things. So these are the 10 Commandments, and they're foundational. They are not, however, the only commandments. There are 613 commandments in the Torah. The rabbis counted, 613. Most of them are of a different sort. They are called casuistic law. Casuistic law is case law. It's unlike the 10 Commandments. It is what happens when you break the law, because we know you're going to, because people break laws. So case law, casuistic law, says if someone does this, then here's what happens. And we have a law code that follows the 10 Commandments and consists of casuistic laws. And it's called the Book of the Covenant. All right, so it begins just after the 10 Commandments with with God speaking to Moses. Thus you shall say to the Israelites, you have seen for yourselves what I spoke with you from heaven, and then continues on with more laws. As we continue into chapter 21, you find that instead of you shall not, you find whoever does, or if a man does this, then here's the consequence. So for example, so this is Exodus 21:15. Whoever strikes father or mother shall be put to death. All right, so it assumes people will do this. Whoever does this, here's the consequence. If you strike your father or mother, you are to be put to death. Whoever kidnaps a person, whether that person has been sold or is still in possession, shall be put to death. It speaks about very practical issues. What happens when people fight? All right, this is where we get the principle of what's called lex talionis, an eye for an eye. All right, that if you hurt someone, there's a law here that says, if people are fighting and they injure a pregnant woman and it causes her to lose the child, then they pay a fine. And if any harm follows, if the woman is injured, if there's harm following, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. So, casuistic law about consequences. And these are very, very similar to other laws we find in the ancient Near East, like the Code of Hammurabi contains actually some of the same laws. There's a law in here about what happens if someone owns an ox and that ox attacks someone and gores them. Well, it depends. If the ox has done this before, then the owner is to is to be punished as well. But if it has not, if the ox has never done it before, then the ox is put to death. But if the ox has done it before, then obviously they didn't keep the law. They didn't keep it they didn't put it to death, and so there are more consequences there. All right. So casuistic law. Most of the laws in the Old Testament are casuistic. We'll see this again in the book of Deuteronomy as well. All of these laws, the Ten Commandments and the Book of the Covenant, are written down on stone tablets. So in Exodus 24, verse 12, the Lord said to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain and wait there. I will give you the tablets of stone with the law and the commandment which I have written for their instruction." So it's written on these stone tablets by God, and thus is considered the Word of God. Now, so we have casuistic laws here. Now, these are civil laws that governed Israelite society. This was their laws for society. Most of the priestly law, though, consists of specifically priestly law, priestly cultic law. So the rest of Exodus is not general law. It is religious law that pertains to the priesthood and the temple. We're not going to go through all of that, but to hit some of the highlights there. From Exodus 25 to 31, there are instructions given for the construction of holy objects. These include the Ark of the Covenant, which was a gold overlaid box with a golden lid that contained mementos of the Exodus and the covenant between God and Israel. It has a copy of the stone tablets are going to be put in there, as well as a jar of manna, which is the bread that God fed the Israelites while they lived in the wilderness, and also the rod of Moses' brother Aaron, which buds to signify God's choice of him as a priest. Those are going to be put in there. But this is the holiest object. The top of it is called the kaparot, sometimes translated as mercy seat, although that's not really a good translation of it. Is that it has these two images of cherubim, these angelic beings on them, and this goes inside the temple later on, or the tabernacle here initially, and it is the place where the priests will make atonement. They will sprinkle the blood of a sacrificial animal on it, and that will atone for sin. We'll talk about that more in a moment. So they make that. They make the tabernacle itself, which is a tent version of a temple that they could move around in the wilderness, and other furnishings. There's a table of bread. There's a candlestick. There are some other altars and a big bowl of water for the priests to wash off in. Also, the garments that the priests would wear. They had special clothing that they would wear, and that is all given instructions here on how to build it. And then in Exodus 35 to 40, they carry out those instructions. They actually build the sanctuary. Now, in between those two, between the instructions on what to build and the actual building of it, there's a little narrative inserted in there about the breaking of the covenant. And this is sort of an ominous foreshadowing of what Israelite history will be like, that no sooner have they received the commandments and the law than they begin to break them. So what happens is that Moses is up on the mountain, and he's been gone a really long time. And the people begin to get restless. They think maybe God killed him because they see all this fire and smoke on the mountain. And so they are concerned that they now have no leader to lead them. And maybe they're even a little bit afraid of this God that they think may have just killed Moses. So they come to Aaron, Moses' brother, and they demand that he make for them a god that they can worship that will lead them. So they come to Aaron and they say, "Come, make gods for us, who will go before us, as this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has happened to him." So they demand that he make them a god. So Aaron takes the gold and the silver that the people have, all the earrings and jewelry. He melts it down. He builds a golden bull, usually translated as a calf, but actually the Hebrew word there, egel, means bull, not calf specifically, so it could have been an adult bull. And he says to them, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." And so they begin to worship this idol, which violates two commandments. They're worshiping another god, and they're worshiping an image. Although it actually seems like they are identifying this with the God of the Exodus. They say, "These are your gods who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." So perhaps they're even attributing the Exodus to a different God and worshiping it here. Of course, Moses comes down. Well, God tells Moses the people have done this, and Moses comes down and sees it, what has happened, and he breaks the tablets. It says, Moses' anger burned hot, and he threw the tablets from his hand and broke them at the foot of the mountain. Now, on the one hand, maybe he's just angry. You know, you're angry, you break things. One of my kids does that all the time. But I think there's more to it than that. The commandments symbolize, the expectations of God. This is the covenant, right? This is the agreement, the contract between God and Israel is bound up in these commandments. Then this symbolizes that they have broken the covenant. The covenant is no good anymore. It's already been broken. They have violated the terms. And so it may symbolize that. It also may invoke punishments, because in the ancient Near East, words were considered to have power. Writing and reading were this mysterious thing that most people could not do. And so they thought that the fact that you could take words and put them down on stone or on clay or on paper was just mysterious to them. It was this magical thing. And so we find actually these what are called execration texts. We find these in Egypt. They would write spells or curses on objects. Usually it'd be like an image. They make a statue of a person. They'd write a curse on it, and they would break it. And the breaking of the image with the item with the words on it was meant to release the power of those words, would release the curses, and so that they would take effect. It may be that that's what's happening here, that he's engaging in this practice to say that you've broken it, and now you're going to reap the consequences, because the result is that there's a plague sent on the people, and many of them die. And after this event, God says, I will not personally go up in front of the people. I will send an angel to lead the people, because they are rebellious, and I know I'll kill them if I'm there with them. So again, we think about holiness and gradated holiness. God is now setting a buffer between himself and the people, recognizing that they are not holy enough to live alongside him. So that's kind of sad and ominous here, but that's what happens. So we kind of end the book of Exodus, with of course that's in the in between, and then they actually build the items, but they move on. The next book, which we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on, is Leviticus. Most people never read Leviticus. It's long. Well, it's not super long, but it's incredibly boring. It starts out with the first 7 chapters are just instructions on how to perform animal sacrifices, what you do with this organ and what you do with that, what you have to burn, what kind of offerings to offer when. So it's a cure for insomnia. All right? But it's still an incredibly important book, because their whole religious system, the whole idea of atonement, and atonement means reconciliation with God. You could say at one-ment. Sorry, if you break that down, at one, it makes you at one with God. It reunites you with God. So the idea is, again, sin is a breakdown of creation, and in that process, it separates us from God. It breaks the relationship that exists between God and humanity. And God, because he is holy, has to separate from us if we're sinful. Atonement is bringing us back together. It's removing the sin and the effects of the sin that separate us from God. And their whole system of atonement depends upon these sacrifices and the temple services. So it's a very, very important book. A few things that I do want to look at here in particular. One is the consecration of the priesthood. So we read about this in Exodus 8 through 10. Aaron's sons are chosen as priests. Right? Aaron and two of his sons are chosen as priests. All of the priesthood, in theory, is supposed to be the descendants of Aaron. Now, this isn't always the case. In some periods of Israelite history, people who are not supposed to be priests become priests. But here in Leviticus, it supports an Aaronic priesthood. So there's a whole ordination ritual here. They are sprinkled with water and with blood, and they get the clothing, and they are ordained as priests, set apart, right? Again, this idea of holiness. They are unique now. They are the only people. They are chosen and set apart as priests. But there's also a tragic story. There's a story here. There's a warning about not respecting the holiness of God and of the things of God. So in Leviticus 10, Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, violate the sanctity of the tabernacle. It says that each of them took their censer, put fire in it, and laid incense on it, and they offered what is called unholy fire before the Lord, such as he had not commanded them. Now, what is unholy fire? It's not completely clear here. It could be that they had done something improperly. Maybe they hadn't, they hadn't taken proper precautions. They hadn't followed instructions, and so the fire is contaminated in some way. It may mean that they are doing this presumptuously, that God is not the proper time. Priests couldn't just walk in and do whatever they wanted any time. There were set times. It could mean that they took it upon themselves to make this offering, and God was displeased. But what happens is that it says the fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. So they die because of improper conduct and improper handling of holy things inside the tabernacle. This is a very stern warning in the priestly code about the importance of maintaining the sanctity of the tabernacle. It's a dangerous place. All right? So later on, we'll see this same kind of thing. In 2 Samuel, there's a story about a guy who touches the Ark of the Covenant and dies because of it. They took this very, very seriously, the separation that needed to be maintained. After this story, we get a section of purity laws from chapters 11 through 15. These concern things like dietary laws, what foods they're allowed to eat, rules on various diseases and contaminations, and what happens if you have them, like leprosy. What happens if you have leprosy? So they're about maintaining sanctity, maintaining holiness, maintaining cleanliness. But then we come to another very important chapter, and that is in chapter 16. This is the Day of Atonement ritual. Day of Atonement is the most important day of the year as it relates to priestly theology, as it relates to atonement. This is the day when the high priest would go into the innermost section of the temple, what's called the Holy of Holies. And the only thing that is in there is the Ark of the Covenant. All right, no one is allowed to go in there except for the high priest, and only on this day. Otherwise, they will die. On this day, he's able to go in there. In fact, he has to go in there because he has the task of atoning for the sins of the nation. And here's how that works. There are 2 goats that are taken. One of them is called the scapegoat, or the goat for Azazel. And this goat, the priest places his hand on, and he ritually transfers all of the sins of the whole nation over the past year onto this goat. And the goat is then sent out into the wilderness to Azazel. And who is Azazel? Well, we don't know. It seems to be some sort of a wilderness demon or a pagan god. In later Jewish texts, from much later, from an apocalyptic book called First Enoch, there's a fallen angel that is named Azazel. And maybe there's some sort of a story about Azazel in the background here. It more likely is the other way around, that from Azazel in Leviticus 16, this story is constructed. But whatever happens, the goat is sent out there. The idea there is to remove the source of the disease, remove the contamination. The other goat is then slaughtered, and its blood is sprinkled on the Ark of the Covenant, on the top, on the kaparot. And that removes the effects of the sin. It resets everything. So if you imagine that over the course of the year, all the boundaries in creation have broken down because of sin, and it's all beginning to collapse in on itself, this hits the reset button and it restores everything. So everything is now as it should be for the next year. So it's an incredibly important chapter for their theology. And this is how they maintained creation. They maintained holiness. They restored it when it was lost. Then finally, Leviticus ends with a section of laws called the Holiness Code. These are more practical. These are actually somewhat similar to the Book of the Covenant. These are laws that actually did apply to all Israelites. They were basic ethics. So prohibitions against worshiping other gods, against divination, improper relationships, so like things like incest are spoken of here as well. There are some positive instructions as well about how to care for the poor, how to maintain society. Justice, issues of justice are spoken of here as well, but that's called the Holiness Code. And it's the instructions on how do you live so as to not cause problems with holiness in Israel. Finally, the last consideration of priestly literature that I want to look at here is in the book of Numbers. And actually we'll go into some of it that is not actually priestly as well. Numbers begins with a census. This is where the name of the book comes from. The first 10 chapters is just genealogies. It's a census of the Israelites who come out of Egypt. And they count up 603,550 adult males. That doesn't include Levites, it doesn't include women, it doesn't include children. You add those in, you're talking probably well over 2 million people at least, if not more. So it's a huge number. One of the problems we'll see when we get later on into like Joshua and Judges is that as far as archaeology can tell, there were not nearly that many people in ancient Israel. So where do these people go? Do they die off in the wilderness? Some scholars regard this number as maybe symbolic, or maybe off by about a magnitude of 10, because actually the population estimates for Israel later on are around 60,000. Here you get 600,000. So numbers sometimes in the Bible are funny. That most of the issues we have seem to relate to numbers. So there's a lot of people, though. There's a story in chapter 11 about the people complaining for meat. They get tired of eating this bread, this manna that comes down from heaven every night. And they say, we want meat. And they complain to Moses, and Moses is angry and says, God, why don't you just kill me if it's going to be like this? God's solution to this is he tells Moses to choose 70 people, 70 elders of the people, and that God will take some of the divine spirit that rests on Moses, sort of God's anointing of him, and will divide it among these 70, and so they will help to lead the people for him. This is sort of the origins of the idea of the elders of Israel as leaders of the people, and later on in New Testament times, that group is called the Sanhedrin. It's a group of 70 elders who rule over the people on religious matters. Finally, they arrive at the Promised Land. So in chapter 13, Numbers 13. They arrive at the border of the promised land, the Jordan River, and they send out 12 spies into the land to see what it's like, do some reconnaissance, what we got to do to conquer this land. One from each tribe of Israel. They come back with the report that the inhabitants of the land are giants. They say we saw the Nephilim there. If you think back to Genesis 6, 1 through 4, the Nephilim there are the offspring of the angels and the human women. They say we saw the Nephilim, these giants, these superhumans there. The cities are big. They have big walls. The land is prosperous. Sure, there are huge, it is a land flowing with milk and honey, huge clusters of grapes, but we can't possibly conquer this land. Now, there are two spies who do not agree, Joshua and Caleb. Joshua is Moses' right-hand man. They say it doesn't matter. If the God who delivered us from slavery in Egypt is certainly able to give us victory over these people. But they are outnumbered 10-2. So the people refuse to conquer the land. And the punishment is that God says, since you lacked faith, since you weren't willing to go in to the land, you will wander in the desert for 40 years until all that generation dies off, except for Joshua and Caleb, the two minority reports, will die off, and your children will inherit the land, not you, because of your lack of faith. Right? So this begins most of the rest of the book of Numbers is stories about those 40 years, and it's a time of problems. The people rebel against Moses' leadership, against Aaron and Miriam, his brother and sister. They sin in various ways, and there are plagues and instances where people are killed. And so it sort of sets you up to expect that the people are not going to be particularly good at obeying the covenant. There is finally a story toward the end here involving a guy named Balaam. So one of the more famous stories from this book, the story of Balaam. Now, Balaam is actually a known historical figure. He's mentioned in a text from a site called Der Allah, an archaeological site. There's a text there from the 9th to 8th century BC that mentions this guy named Balaam, who was a prophet. Well, he's mentioned here, so apparently he was quite famous. He is hired to pronounce a curse upon the Israelites. So they're walking around through the wilderness, and they're coming up to the plains of Moab, and there's a king named Balak who sees all the Israelites, and he's afraid of them, so he hires Balaam to pronounce a curse upon them so that they will perish and not threaten his kingdom. Well, Balaam is on his way to go and do that, and an angel appears on the road, but Balaam cannot see the angel, and so his donkey speaks to him, and he starts beating this donkey because the donkey sees the angel and won't go forward. So he's beating the donkey, and the donkey speaks. He says, "Why are you hitting me? I'm your donkey. I've done all the things you wanted me to do." And suddenly Balaam's eyes are open, and he's able to see the angel. And he realizes that, God is with these people. I'm not going to be able to do anything. So he goes to Balak, and he says, I'm only going to be able to speak what God will allow me to say. And so he opens his mouth, and instead of cursing the Israelites, blessings come out. It's like God has taken over his mouth. And Balak, of course, is very upset about that. I paid you to curse them, not bless them. So Balaam comes up with another solution. He says, well, I can't curse them, but here's what you can do. Get them to violate the covenant with their God. Get them to worship other gods. And that will cause their God to abandon them. All right? And so they do. they begin to intermarry and have sexual relations with the women of Moab, and that leads them to sacrifice and worship their gods. And sure enough, God kills off a bunch of them. But again, this is the book of Numbers is a kind of a tragic book in a lot of ways about the failure of the people up until they, during those 40 years and toward the end when they arrive at the land and begin to conquer it from east to west. But we'll talk about that more when we get to the book of Joshua. So again, the main things you want to get out of this are to understand priestly theology. It's going to be very, very foundational moving forward. We'll see it in many different texts. So be sure you understand that.